What's up, everybody? Welcome to Make Things Tiny. My name is Mick. So there's one state that I feel like we don't really talk too much about when it comes to tiny houses. And one of you did drop a comment recently wondering whether or not there are tiny house communities in the state. So today we are talking about Alaska. We're going to talk about whether or not Alaska is a good place for you to go tiny and what the tiny house sort of landscape looks like. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and let's jump into it. Let's talk about tiny homes in Alaska. Right, so today we're talking about Alaska. Specifically, we're talking about sort of like the tiny house landscape, culture, if you will, around tiny homes in Alaska. So if you were to go to tiny house listings and put Alaska into the search bar, you wouldn't actually find anything. So I had to do some digging to figure out what it looks like to go tiny in this particular state. So instead I went to Zillow. So I'm going to start this video off with talking about what I found when I went to Zillow. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is that you can find homes that have a smaller footprint. So there's a home available right now in Willow, Alaska, for $69,000, and it's 144 square feet. Now, this is in the realm of what I've talked about before, where for some of you, it might make more sense to buy land with the structure already on it. Now, this is pretty small. I don't know if you want to live in the 144 square foot studio that they're calling it, but you might want to build a tiny house there, and the land is relatively affordable. So this is what it looks like if you're going to look at tiny homes in Alaska. You're probably going to have to go to a place like Zillow. But there are tiny house builders in Alaska. So I was able to find a builder called Stick Construction. They build tiny homes. It looks like they build tiny homes a little bit wider, so up to 20 feet wide, which is kind of like enormous for a tiny home. So you can check them out. They're saying that they're like the premier builder for custom tiny homes in Alaska. So you do have builders in Alaska, which is great because if you're looking to go tiny in a particular state, you want to find a builder in that state so that you can reduce your delivery costs. Those of you who are currently in the tiny house sort of like shopping stage, if you will, have already found out, for better or worse, that delivery costs can become pretty expensive. So you definitely want to find a builder as close to where you want your home to be as humanly possible. Next up is another builder called Alaska Tiny Home. So they seem relatively new. They seem brand new, actually, at least within the last year and a half or so, from the time that this video is recorded in early 2025. So this is another option. They have some tiny home models you can check out as well, too. Now, the laws in Alaska don't differ too much from laws anywhere else around the country. They vary county to county. I was able to look into the laws in Petersburg County, and I found that it's got to be less than 400 square feet, but it has to be on foundation. So I am starting to see more and more counties as I look up tiny house communities and laws in different states that are restricting tiny homes to tiny houses on foundation. So you're going to need a building permit. Tiny homes on wheels are classified as RVs, so those are not long-term dwellings. They can't be single-family dwellings. They're not allowed in residentially zoned areas. And your home has to be inspected if it's built off-site. So that's another thing as well, too. So just keep that in mind. It's got to be on foundation for the most part, just to make sure everything is legit. So I wanted to look and see if there are tiny house communities in Alaska. Now, normally I'll do like a longer, like entire long form video on tiny house communities. I'm still doing that, but I also wanted to make sure I provide a little more information on whether or not it makes sense to even go tiny in a specific area, whether there are communities there or not. So we're going to check out whether or not there are communities in Alaska. When I did that, I only found one tiny house community in the entire state. And it has a few restrictions. So it's created by a company called In Our Backyard. So I'm calling it the In Our Backyard Tiny House Village. This is what their website looks like. When I looked at their website a little bit further, looked at the frequently asked questions, I found that they're based out of Anchorage, Alaska, so a major city in the state. They are essentially on the property of the Central Lutheran Church, so that's the church sort of like runs this village. They have 6 homes as of 2024. Each home has a restroom and a trailer. They range from like 65 to 100 square feet. So they are kind of like bare essentials here. I wouldn't call it transitional housing because it seems like the idea is to keep people safe. It's specifically for the 50 plus age group. So there's been some issues with homelessness and housing insecurity. So they're trying to create a solution there, which I think is fantastic. Each area comes with like basics like heater, microwave, fridge, and a bed. This is what they look like. So pretty standard size for some of the more like housing shelters that we're seeing pop up for tiny house villages. But so this isn't an option for anyone to just move into, but it does show that there's potential here in Alaska, that the sort of like landscape for tiny homes is growing. So I figured it was worth mentioning, and they're doing great work too. So if you're currently watching this video and you're either living in Alaska or you're thinking like, I want to move to Alaska, the question becomes, what do you do? Is going tiny worth it? Is something I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. But for right now, I want to say that it is an ADU friendly state, which is great. You can get an ADU on an existing property, or you can build on an existing property. Tiny homes on wheels, we've got a question mark with those because they are registered as, they're classified as RVs, so you can't live in a tiny house, it looks like full-time on wheels at least. You could buy land, you could always create your own tiny home community, so there are land ownership options available. So I'm going to go through some of the things I found when I did a more extensive search on land. So Land Search has been a great website. It's just landsearch.com. You can check it out. You can find land in, all over the country. So when I looked it up here in Alaska, what I found was a couple of things. So in Fairbanks, which is another sort of more well-known city in Alaska, you could get 4 acres for $100,000, which depending on where you live is either a good price or it's a bit of a shocking price. But the positive here is that you've already got 2 structures on this property. So you've got a structure that looks sort of like a tiny home, and then you have a shed. So you have the opportunity to live in those while you build a tiny house and potentially rent them out, get some passive income. So there's some opportunities here if you're willing to be creative, and if you have at least $100,000, ideally probably $200,000 available for a mortgage, so that you can use some of it for developing your tiny home. The next option is $80,000, which is cheaper, and it's 1 acre, so it's less. It's in North Pole, Alaska, which I just think is cool because it's the North Pole. But you have this structure here, which has, seems like a pretty decent sized tiny home where you have full kitchen and things like that. So you could honestly just buy this and just live in this tiny home. Maybe do some renovations, maybe create another tiny home down the line. Over time, you could have your own little mini resort if you wanted. And then lastly, I found 100 acres, which is not, maybe it's not as much as you would need because it's a lot, in a city in Alaska I've never heard of, but it's $300,000. It still seems like a good deal for 100 acres, but I'm not familiar with Alaska. I don't know much about Alaska at all. So if you're familiar with Alaska or you live there, definitely drop a comment. Any knowledge or information you're willing to share, I totally appreciate it. But yeah, so you can get 100 acres for $300K. And that just opens up a lot of opportunities. You could live in a tiny house community. You could put tons of tiny homes there. It's really kind of sort of like sky's the limit in terms of what you could do, but you'd have to have that amount of money available. So when we're thinking about Alaska and we're considering whether or not it's good for tiny living, there's some pros and there's some cons. I'm just going to talk about all of them. The pro side is that it's ADU friendly, right? And that's a permanent, foundation sort of situation. The plus side is that you can technically have a tiny house on wheels, so they're not opposed to them. You just can't use it as a primary dwelling. The weather could be a plus depending on what you're interested in, fishing, hiking, lots of outdoor activities. It does get really cold as well too, so that's something you have to consider. And then cost of living as well, depending on parts where you're coming from, Alaska could be more affordable or less affordable. The downsides, in my opinion, include the ADU options. When you're restricted like that, it does create problems, and we don't know what the situation looks like for ADU builders in the area, or if it's difficult to deliver things to Alaska if you have a builder outside of the state. There is land available, but it's pricey and some of it's undeveloped, so you're not really sure what's going to cost to develop it. And again, depending on where you're located, it could be harder to get supplies. The remote options can be a plus or a minus. I'm putting it here on the negative because it seems like most of you don't really want to be in a remote area. And you're first to market, which again could be a plus, but I'm putting it here on the negative side because you're going to have to be the one to create a lot of these opportunities, and that could cause, there could be issues with red tape and stuff like that, depending on what you have to deal with. So what do you think? Would you move to Alaska? Is it on your list of places you would love to go tiny? What does that look like for you? Are any of the options that I've talked about here today, do they seem sort of interesting or attractive to you in terms of land ownership? But yeah, drop comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. I'll keep looking up tiny house communities. I just wanted to create videos where I talk about whether or not it makes sense to live in some of these places and not just what the community options are for you. So again, I appreciate you guys so much for watching. Definitely ask questions. Love to hear from you guys, and don't forget to think tiny. I'll see you guys in the next one.